The studio lights blazed hot as Rosie O'Donnell leaned forward across the talk show table, her voice cutting through the air like a blade as she questioned Jasmine Crockett's qualifications with a tone dripping in condescension. The audience fell silent, and the camera zoomed in on Jasmine's face as the young congresswoman froze for a split second, processing the insult that had just been delivered live on national television. Then a fire sparked in her eyes, a fire that would soon silence Rosie and turn the confrontation into one of the most legendary takedowns in political television history. This was not just a heated exchange. This was about to become a masterclass in dismantling arrogance with precision and grace. Rosie, with decades of fame behind her, leaned back in her blazer and glasses, exuding the swagger of someone who believed she was about to humiliate a young politician. She launched into her attack armed with talking points and notes, dismissing Jasmine's background, mocking her education, and questioning whether she was truly qualified to speak on constitutional law, since she had not studied at elite schools like Harvard, Yale, or Stanford. The audience shifted uncomfortably as Rosie grew bolder, her words laced with the presumption that Jasmine was out of her depth. But what Rosie did not realize was that Jasmine Crockett was far from the lightweight she imagined. At just 33 years old, Jasmine represented Texas's 30th District and carried with her not only years of legal practice, but credentials that rivaled many of the legal scholars Rosie so idolized. She had fought for working families, championed civil rights, and earned her seat in Congress through skill and determination, not privilege or celebrity. The moment Rosie pressed further, demanding to know if Jasmine had even taken constitutional law, the studio fell into a tense silence, the weight of the insult lingering heavily in the air. Rosie, misreading the stillness, twisted the knife deeper, insisting that from her perspective Jasmine was in over her head. That was when everything shifted. Jasmine quietly uncrossed her hands, placed them firmly on the table, and lifted her chin ever so slightly. Her eyes locked onto Rosie's with a burning intensity that froze the room. Where moments before she had been composed and polite, now she radiated a presence that commanded respect and signaled to everyone watching that the takedown was about to begin. Several audience members later said they could pinpoint the exact moment when Jasmine transformed from a guest under attack into a lawyer preparing to dismantle an opposing argument, and it was not dramatic or showy, but the quiet, controlled shift of someone who had been underestimated one too many times and was determined to ensure it would never happen again. The studio lighting seemed to catch her differently in that instant, highlighting the firm set of her jaw and the steel in her eyes as camera operators instinctively adjusted angles to capture what they sensed would be a pivotal moment. "Are you finished?" she asked in a steady voice that carried the weight of an unspoken storm, and the words hung in the air like a challenge that froze the audience into complete silence. Rosie misread the shift and smiled smugly as if nothing had changed, insisting that she had made her point, but the confidence in her tone now sounded hollow in the charged atmosphere of the studio. Good Jasmine replied with a calm edge sharp enough to cut glass, and her movements took on the deliberate precision of a seasoned attorney as she reached for a leather briefcase that had been beside her chair the entire time. The soft click of the lock opening echoed through the silence like a warning shot as she began placing documents methodically on the table for all to see. Rosie's confident expression faltered for the first time, and uncertainty crept across her features as she darted her eyes between the papers. The congresswoman and the audience, like someone sensing escape, was no longer possible. "Please," she tried to say with less conviction than before, but Jasmine answered only with a smile that carried the ruthless certainty of a chess master preparing checkmate. She placed a leather portfolio on the table and said with absolute authority that she would be happy to enlighten Rosie about her so-called questionable background, and in that moment the studio leaned forward as one, while social media erupted outside the walls, unaware that history was about to be made. Jasmine opened the portfolio with the deliberate calm of a prosecutor, and the lights gleamed against the gold lettering of the documents inside as she held up her Juris Doctor from the University of Houston Law Center, reminding everyone that the school ranked among the very best for constitutional law. Rosie's face went pale as the research she had clung to suddenly looked flimsy, and Jasmine was only beginning. She revealed her bachelor's degree from Rhodes College with magna cum laude honors, and reminded the audience that it was one of the most respected liberal arts colleges in America. Then, with growing force, she declared that she had specialized in constitutional law, competed in moot courts against the brightest legal minds in the country, and consistently earned a place on the dean's list. She laid out credentials and certifications one after another, including recognition from the American Civil Liberties Union for her constitutional work, and the audience began to applaud as the attack unraveled before their eyes. Jasmine rose to her feet then, her voice no longer defensive but resounding with authority as she condemned Rosie for never once engaging with her actual policy positions or her legal arguments, but instead relying on shallow assumptions about image and pedigree. Rosie tried to interrupt, but Jasmine cut her off, sharply declaring that what Rosie had truly suggested was that she was not qualified to do the job that the people of Texas had elected her to do, and in that moment the entire studio knew the confrontation had transformed into a devastating lesson in both law and respect. That my education was questionable without bothering to learn what that education actually was, she declared as she rose from her chair and began walking slowly around the table, her voice carrying with deliberate force to every corner of the studio. "Do you know what I did before I came on your show today, Rosie?" she asked, her tone steady yet sharp. "I researched your background." Rosie's eyes widened, clearly not expecting the tables to turn with such precision. "I found that you dropped out of college after your sophomore year," Jasmine continued. "I found that you built your career on entertainment, not education. I found that you have no legal training, no constitutional law expertise, and no formal education in political science or government." The audience gasped, a ripple of shock moving through the studio, and then scattered claps began to rise until the sound of applause filled the room. "But here's the difference between us, Rosie," Jasmine pressed on, her voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority. "I also found that you built a successful career, that you created jobs for hundreds of people, that you used your platform to advocate for causes you believe in. I found that you donated millions to charity and that you fought for LGBTQ rights when it was neither popular nor easy to do so. I found that despite not having formal credentials, you demonstrated real leadership on issues that mattered." The studio fell into a stunned silence, even Rosie's harshest critics caught off guard by this unexpected turn in tone. "But did I come on your show to question your qualifications to have political opinions?" Jasmine asked, her voice rising with controlled intensity. "Did I ever suggest that you do not belong in the conversation simply because you lack formal credentials?" "Credentials, no, Rosie, I did not, because I believe every American has a right to engage in political discourse regardless of educational background," Jasmine said as she paused, letting the weight of her words press down on the room. "What I do not respect and what I will never tolerate is when someone uses their platform to tear down others with assumptions and prejudice. What I will not accept is when someone tries to silence voices they dislike by questioning credentials they have not even bothered to verify." She returned to the table, standing behind her chair with the authority of a seasoned courtroom attorney. "You could have asked me about my policy position," she continued. "You could have challenged my voting record. You could have pressed me on constitutional interpretations, and that would have been a legitimate and worthy conversation for your audience, but instead you chose to make this personal. You attacked my intelligence, my education, my qualifications, without even doing the basic research that any responsible journalist should do before making such claims. That is not political discourse, Rosie. That is lazy prejudice disguised as intellectual superiority." She remained standing her presence, now dominating the entire studio. "What I do not respect is when people hide behind a veneer of superiority to dismiss others without learning the facts." Jasmine then picked up her portfolio, but this time pulled out a tablet. "Since we are talking about research, let us share some actual facts," she said, tapping the screen. "According to the Congressional Research Service, I am one of only 37 members of Congress with a law degree from a Texas law school. I am one of fewer than 200 members who specialize in constitutional law. In my first term alone, I introduced or co-sponsored 23 pieces of legislation dealing directly with constitutional issues." The silence was absolute as her voice carried with unshakable authority. "But here's the most important fact," she said, locking eyes with Rosie, who now sat frozen. "I was elected by the people of Texas's 30th District, not because of where I studied, but because of my commitment to fighting for their rights, defending their interests, and protecting their constitutional freedoms." She snapped the portfolio shut with finality. "So to answer your original question, Rosie, what qualifies me is my education, my experience, my dedication to the Constitution, and above all the trust placed in me by the voters who sent me here to be their voice." Jasmine sat down, folding her hands calmly on the table, her point delivered with devastating clarity. Now, did you have any actual policy questions you want to discuss, or will you continue making uninformed assumptions about my qualifications? Rosie O'Donnell sat in silence for perhaps the first time in her career. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged as the cameras captured her stunned expression and the rising applause from the audience. The woman who had built her reputation on never being at a loss for words was suddenly speechless. The silence stretched into long seconds, broken only by the growing ovation from the crowd. Rosie fumbled with her notes, glancing down and back at Jasmine, but her confidence had vanished. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled frantically, debating whether to cut away or let the scene unfold. Some wanted to spare Rosie further humiliation, while others knew they were witnessing television history. The energy in the studio crackled as audience members whispered excitedly, and some discreetly lifted their phones to record despite restrictions. Rosie sat frozen, her usually animated hands motionless on the table, her entire presence diminished before the calm and commanding figure of Jasmine Crockett, who had just delivered one of the most decisive and devastating responses ever seen on political television.